Shut up and sit down.
Hey folks, this is Tony Day. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into the corrections and the grading that were done for the shots that were used in the first video of this series, which is called Does Brand Color Science Really Matter? So this is part 2. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, please make sure to watch that because that will give you an idea of what we were going for with these. I'll just say right off the top here, if you like this video and you want to see more of it, please hit like and subscribe, and also please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TonyDay. Now, let's kind of get into this. So I'm going to click through the images, and what I want to do here is just make sure that I clarify what the point is and what it isn't. So the point is of doing this correction and getting these to look similar is not to get them to be a one-to-one match with each other. That wasn't really the goal. Even though they are pretty close, there are clearly some differences when we can see them back to back. But that wasn't really the goal of that video. The goal was that it was for you as a viewer to look at those being images that are pretty close to each other and determine if there was anything really to gain from the brand color science specifically, if they could look similar enough. And that's really the goal here. For me, as long as things look close enough, I'm not really going to buy a brand specifically to get whatever that look is. And I figured if there was something inherent that was so much better about a brand in the color science for things like skin tones and whatever, that I should be able to see it using an ACES transform and doing some corrections and grading. So we're going to explore that together in the way that I did. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn off the grade entirely, and we are going to open it like how a lot of people will see it. So most people, when they open up images, it'll look like this, right? This is raw. These aren't blown out or anything. It's just doing like a, I don't know. Yeah, it's doing a Rec 709 conversion without mapping these tones. So just kind of ignore that. We could, change the way that this is done, and the highlight roll off will pick this, and you can see it comes right back. So there's nothing really wrong with the way that this is shot. It's this just how it is. Um, when we look at it originally, you're going to see how different the exposure can look in the waveform monitor between these. And this is going to be important because as you see here, middle gray is exposed down here. This one is obviously not conforming to a log standard. It's in Rec 709. Actually, let's just go ahead and change that to log. So it'll be around like this. But you can see that between these, they look a little bit closer, but even here, the middle gray is exposed differently between these. Here on the Canon's much higher compared to the FX6, okay? Just so you know, this is the red, this is the FX6, this is the C500, C70, and the R5, okay? Just so that's clear. So those differences in exposure are going to come into play, okay? So this is what it would look like just with log or whatever, all right? So we're going to be putting all of this into ACES in Resolve. So I'm going to go into the color management here. We're going to go into ACES CCT. We're going to use 1.2. No input transform because we're going to have to do this manually for the non-raw images. The output device transform is going to be in Rec 709, and we're going to use the ACES CC AP1 timeline space for LUTs. We're not going to use any LUTs, but we'll just leave it on there as default, and then we'll hit save. Okay, and when we do that, you're going to get the transforms. Okay, anything that is raw, like the red, the Canon C500, and the R5, it's going to automatically go into ACES, okay? So each of the RAWs we don't have to do anything with. But for the other cameras, we are going to have to make sure that we have the right input color space. So we right-click here, ACES Input Transform, and then we pick the right one. For this one, it's S-Log3 S-Gamut 3 Cine, and for the C70, we'll go ACES Input Transform. And here's where I think the Canons are really interesting. Each Canon model seems to have its own stuff. I don't really understand why it's like this. with the Canon specifically. Like if I go into the old reds, you can see that they had dragon color and all that. Now it's all conformed to the same color, which is much easier. Sony also has for S-Log2, which is generally with like say 8-bit or the older S-Gamut, it makes sense to use either of these. But with S-Log3 and S-Gamut 3 or 3 Cine, um, most cameras conform here, and then the Venice has its own. But generally speaking, getting Sony into Aces tends to be a lot easier than Canon. You gotta really pick the right one in here. So we'll go and hit C70 Log 2 Daylight, and that's what we used. And we'll close down the clips. So now everything is being pushed into the Aces color space and the output. Okay. When we go through each of these, you can really see how the exposure differences between each camera are playing out. Okay. This is not something that is a negative function of ACEs. This is just how exposure works. If you expose one thing less, it's going to have one, output transform, and then ones that are quite a bit higher are going to have a brighter overall look. And something that you also have to notice is that the way that your vector scope is going to show the colors is also dependent on the exposure because these are all RGB values being interpreted, right? And I'll show you real quick what I mean. Um, if if you think that we're going to immediately, without matching the exposure across the cameras, be able to get the colors in the vector scope to look closer, you need to think again because that's not how this is going to operate. And I'll show you how that vector scope is going to change depending on what we do just with exposure. So I'm going to add a node that's on top of all this other stuff here that's separate just so we can experiment. And we'll turn on the grades here. So you can see without us doing anything, this is how it looks, okay? Now here, I'm just going to change the exposure, okay? Now watch how that vector scope changes. See? How it's now a lot closer to what we saw with the Canon, okay? It's not exact, but it's a lot closer. So by just I won't say underexposing, but by comparison, let's just say by comparison, underexposing the FX6 compared to the Canon, they're going to look different regardless, unless you change the exposure to be at least similar, okay? Because that is part of the function of how the color is being interpreted for the final output in Rec 709, okay? And we can do the same thing the other way with the Canon. We'll pull this down like this. See how now it looked more like the Sony? And then we're going to pull the exposure down like that. And you can see how they start having more like, yellows. It's like kind of crunched together, these values down here. It just looks different, okay? So we need to get the exposure the same across them before we start correcting color. That's really what I'm trying to say here. And also, when you do your test between them, make sure that you expose them a similar way. If you're overexposing on one of them, you need to do that across them to get a closer match. If you're exposing at middle gray, you should probably do that for each. If you're underexposing each, then underexpose each if you really want to try to get them to be as similar as possible. Something else that you'll notice between these is that the white balance, or just the overall balance between them, is going to be different in color because they just seem to be different. The red, when you look here, it looks green by comparison to the Sony, and the Sony looks different compared to the Canon. The Canon looks almost like it's magenta by comparison. So there's quite a difference in the way that these cameras are balanced for white balance, but that's not hard to correct. At all. So that is kind of our steps. I also, on each of these, have this is the same denoise across the board. It's just I usually do this as a chroma denoise, simply because each one, any of these cameras really could do with a little bit of chroma denoising. So I have that being done there. There's no luma denoising just in the chroma here. Okay. So if we look through each of these images here, you can see that 4 of them are exposed quite a bit brighter than the other fifth one. Okay, so also in the exposure, we can see that there is a difference in how they're exposed. There's definitely a contrast difference in the middle of the image because it was different time of day between these. Uh, so, that is something that we have to keep in mind. Um, but we can, for the most part, get the exposure pretty much the same. And one of the reasons why skin tones need to be similar across the board is because it's not only the color of skin that matters, but it's also the brightness of it as well. Usually, if it fits in a certain range, it looks better than others. So we just want to make sure they're all around the same range so that nothing gets, a benefit from either being exposed brighter or darker from each other. Okay, so here in exposure, I'll turn that on and we'll just go down the line and turn on our exposure. You can see that on the FX6 compared to the red, I did quite a bit less as far as exposure because basically with the FX6, if I was to push up the exposure a lot, it would be very unfair to it simply because we'd be adding a lot more noise than should be there. Usually if you add more gain in post, you have more noise than using negative gain, which is pulling exposure down in post. So, doing it where, this one gets to be pulled down and I'd have to pull the FX6 up significantly would just simply not be fair to the FX6 at all. So each of these got pulled down in exposure in order to be more what I would call a normal result for exposure. So when we go between each of these, you're going to notice that they're a lot closer. So you'll notice that in this test, also there's this contrast difference in the background, and we had to account for that and try to be fair to each camera as much as possible. Um, and even though these three images seem to have more contrast in it, it's because in the scene there is more contrast. This shot and this shot they don't have that sunlight raking through. Okay, so we have to be wary of that. Obviously, it would be better if that sunlight raking through wasn't there, but sometimes circumstances just kind of get in the way of making it absolutely scientifically perfect. So we're just going to do with what we have. So we want to make sure that the skin tones, which seem more consistently exposed across, are kept the same. If you look here, this is where the skin is. I'll use the medicine dropper so you can see. See it right there? Okay. If you notice, those blobs on the waveform are going to be a lot closer to each other as far as exposure than the gray card. So it kind of was a decision-making time here. Do we get the skin to look the same or the gray card to look the same? And I picked the skin tones to look closer because they are more what people care about rather than middle gray. The next thing that I did was I balanced off the gray card using offset. And we'll just go through each of these images and turn on the balance. And this is for neutral gray. This is not to make like a look. The point here was not to make a specific look or anything like that. The point was to get the images to look as neutral as possible off of that gray card. And if you look across them, they look pretty close to each other. Okay. Now you will still notice that there's a difference between the way that color is being interpreted across these. They're not exactly the same as we go across. Okay, you can see there appears to be more saturation in this one compared to this one compared to this one. And these are all Canon. This is where I found it to be really interesting. This is raw, right? And then this is raw. But there's a lot more saturation here than in either of the other two. And these are all Canon images, okay? This is C500, it's all as shot. And then here is the R5, okay? So I just thought this is the most interesting thing I thought out of the whole thing was that the Canon color science between each of these, whatever conditions were there, were giving me different results, which I thought was I thought was interesting. The next thing that I did was I looked through each of these and I determined what I thought looked like the best out of the box Aces Rec 709 color science. Like which one of these, if I had to be stuck with whatever happened here, which one of these did I like the best? And I like the red the best. I thought this looked the best out of all of them. I especially like the way that her face looks. I think it might be the lensing, or maybe it's just her expression, or could be the color, could be a number of things, but I just thought that this image looked the best out of all of them. I felt that this one had a little bit too much, I don't know, magenta in the skin compared to this one. This just looked really nice to me. And I especially liked it compared to these two cannons and this one. This one, it looked like this skin it just didn't have as much life in it as this one. That's just my opinion, though. You might be different, and that's all fine. If you like, this one, make them look like this one. So the next thing that I did was I graded this one to look more like I preferred. And part of that is to decrease the saturation in a bunch of these areas. Some of these colors were just a little too saturated. So I'll turn this on so you can see what I did. So we'll go full frame now. We'll go, this is before, after, okay? So what I was trying to do was I wanted to keep the original Rec 709 look because in my view, this had the best camera color science, right? If it went into Aces and the Rec 709 conversion, in my view, looked the best, that would be representative of what I thought the best camera's color science was, at least in going into Aces and getting a look. This is the red Monstro. And in my opinion, this looked the best. And by adjusting the saturation here, we were able to get what I thought was a most pleasing straight Rec 709 conversion out of all the cameras. So then what I did was in each of these, and I'll go into that compound node to give you more of a look at what happened in there. But in the color compound nodes, all I did was try to get each of these to look similar to what I saw out of the red. It wasn't going to be perfect, and I knew that going in, but I wanted it to look close enough to where I would be okay with it. Okay, so let's go into these color nodes. So I'm going to show the compound node, and here's this one. I don't even remember what this one has. Was it HDR? What did this one do? Let's turn these all off so I can actually see what happened. Okay. Okay, yeah. So this one was just a saturation adjustment. Yeah, so we pulled the saturation down here to get it a little bit closer and workable. Then I used the color warper here. Okay. And then I used a series of adjustments here with the color warper and with the luminance and saturation curve to get this result. Okay. Now there are, maybe some of you saying, well, why did you do this? This way or that way. I think what I had done before, if I remember correctly, was I started with this and then I made some nodes before it so I could control a few of the things before I added some of these saturation adjustments. What I found was really interesting between the Sony and the Red was how much more saturation there tended to be in the shadows by comparison. So that was kind of what I was trying to get out of this node. And also, if you look at the color warper here, you can see which adjustments I made to the colors to get them to look closer. Okay. So if we go back and forth between the two, you can see that I got them to be pretty close, but they're not exact. Again, I knew it wasn't going to be exact going into it, but it's close enough. Okay. I'd call this good enough to where I'd be okay with it. Okay. Um, so there's that. We'll back out of there. Let's go to the next one. So I'll turn on and off the color so you can see what was done here. Okay. And then we'll go into the compound node, and you can see that I did a series of warps here as well. We'll kind of go through them all one by one. Okay, so that's what that one did. I just pulled saturation back, and really it was to try to get certain areas of the saturation to be pulled um, back a bit. This one had some hue and saturation adjustments in certain tonalities as well. And this one looks like it's specifically, I think I was targeting a very specific color in her skin in here. And then we brought the saturation back in, and very similar to what we did in the FX6, we added some saturation in the shadows and decreased it as we got into the highlights. And that's how we got this final. So I'll exit that. We'll go on and off. Let's go full. So that's before, before, after, before, after. Okay. And the big thing to me between the red and the other cameras was how the lips and the skin separation looked. I really liked the reds the best as far as that look. I just thought that, her different skin tones in here just looked better in general compared to all of them. And that was what I was trying to achieve, was I really focused on like the skin tones and tried to get it as close to it as possible, especially this more red look in her lips to her skin. It's just that, let's go full again. If you like, here's the red and then here's the FX6. I don't know how obvious this is to you guys, but for me, right here in her lips, the magenta was a lot more obvious to me than what I would see in the red here. The red just had more of a natural look to it. I can't put my finger on it. And the Canon, I couldn't quite get that red to pop either. Okay, so there's that. Okay, here's the C70. So we'll go full, and then we'll go before, after. I did notice that there was somebody saying something about the C70 and its look that they like the best, and honestly, it's not so much the camera, in my opinion. It's what I did to it. Uh, Honestly, this is what it looked like before I did anything. Okay, this is what it looked like out of camera and in Ace's Transform. And then this is what I did to it. Okay, before, after, before, after. So let's go into this color node here. And we did have a similar setup as the last one. And I did copy paste over because I figured they're Canons. They should operate pretty much the same way. We'll just kind of click through these. Here is how this web was. As you can see, there's quite a few adjustments that are made to get it to look similar. And really, just to kind of iterate here, I use the vector scopes in between different shots to really kind of get them to look the same. And I use this web to direct the colors where I want them to go. And I'll use, an 8 instead of a 6 if I need there to be certain colors that I'm moving around. If you notice here on the 12, there's a lot more kind of divisions between each color, whereas, the 8 spread is 8-point spread is you're going to be affecting more colors that way. And here too, you can see I was trying to get those reds to really, especially in her lips and in her skin, I was trying to get those to be what I about what I wanted. Okay, and we'll just turn on each thing on its own. Here's how this one went. You can see all the adjustments that were made. There's that one. And then here's this one. And then we add our curve on the end. And again, this luminance saturation curve was really important to try to get more saturation in those shadows that the red had. And then we'll go to the last one, which is the Canon R5. And we'll go full screen. This is before, and then after, before, after. Um, so I did notice that, like, in the R5, it was really interesting because the skin tones were being treated as if they needed to be pale. And then, like, the red here is really sticking out, and her hair is sticking out. And I thought that that was really interesting. Um, Again, if we look here, even without the balance, the comparison here, her skin to her lips, it just looks pale by comparison. I'm not sure if why that is. It just that's how it looked to me. And with the balance, and then with the color change I made, you can really see that I had to add more saturation there. We compare that to the red. Um, there's a, let me just so it's more obvious. I'll turn this color off. If you look at the red here, versus the R5, her skin was a lot more pale. And I don't know what she looks like in real life. I can only guess and, go based on what I thought looked the best out of these. But this looked healthier than this. Okay, so that's why I picked this one. Again, I apologize. I don't know what she looks like in real life, but I thought, this here looked a little better than that. It's up to you guys, whatever you want. But part of the point of this, again, was to match what I thought looked best to me out of the box for Rec 709 conversions, and to me, this looked better than this. Okay, so there's that. Um, okay, and we'll go into here, and this one needed a little less work than the others to get it where I got it, and I thought that that was close enough to the red. So the R5 ended up, for me, being one of the easier ones to try to get matching the red. They're not exact, of course, but they're close enough. But yeah, I thought, between them, the red ended up being, or the red and the R5 ended up being pretty easy to match up. Granted, this was the last one that I did in the lineup, so it may be that I just got better as time went on at doing this. But yeah, and here's the webs just in case you need to see them. We'll turn them on individually again so you can see. And you can see here how much we had to pull the bottom end of this of the skin tones up, specifically in the yellows, to get it more like this. It just seemed like for some reason it just wasn't. I don't know. It's just like that color was just not in her skin, and I'm not sure why it was there in the others, but not in this one. It's really interesting. Um, so I hope that you all enjoyed this and have learned from this series. And I just want to reiterate here that it is not important that each of these cameras look exactly the same. That's not really what my goal here was, and I don't think it should be the goal really when you're discerning which camera's color science you think or anybody might think looks the best. It really is which camera is going to provide me with enough information to get the results that I want. And if those results, even if we try to match them in this way, if we can get them pretty close, where it's pretty hard to tell the difference between each camera, how much does that color science coming from the camera really matter? Does it matter more that we have enough information or enough data to create a look that we want in post, or do we have to buy into a camera's color science for that, special sauce that we hear about? And really, it's up to you all to decide that. I can tell you that my opinion is that it's it's not really that important which camera you use. You just need to make sure you get enough data. For me, it's more about capturing enough information in your camera so that you can get the results that you want. I think that it goes without saying that if you're shooting with something like a red camera, where you're recording all of this color data, you're going to be able to get whatever looks you want at the end. Okay. When it comes to more compressed codecs like 10-bit log, 8-bit log that some people shoot, if you have a 12-bit log that you can shoot with, the more compressed you get, the less options you might have to correct things in post. But I think it's a good idea to experiment and find out just how close you can get and whether or not you can get the results that you want. I don't think it comes down to a camera's brand color science. I think it's just more about that information and capturing as much of that as you can and using that tool to its best. If you like this video and would like to see more like it, please like and subscribe, and also please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TonyDay, and I will see you later.